So excited that you're here. I'm so excited for this talk. Oh no, it's doing an echo we're trying to get rid of. Let's see. So should I just do the introduction? Yeah. Okay. So thank you. So my name is Elizabeth McMentetango. I'm a librarian here at UC Merced. And I'm so happy to be able to introduce Dr. Susan Amussen, who is a UC Merced Distinguished Professor of History, who's going to be giving our library faculty author series today. I think you probably saw you can buy books in the back. You also, when you signed in, can get a raffle ticket. We're going to have a raffle for one copy of the book. So you will be able to get a copy even if you don't win the raffle. So, the faculty author series showcases the latest research and scholarship by UC Merced faculty members. And if you'd like to be featured in a future talk, please let me know. For today, Dr. Amussen's research focuses on early modern Britain and the Atlantic world, specifically examining gender, the modern period as a cultural crossroads, and the relationship between history and literature, and the historical context for Shakespeare. She holds an AD from Princeton, where she was magna cum laude in history, and an AM and PhD in history from Brown. And she's been at UC Merced since 2008 and was the founding director of the Center for the Humanities. So we're really thrilled to have you here with us today, and I'm going to turn this over now.
Okay. So I thought I'd start today with a little story before I go into this. But especially because we're having more technical difficulties. This is a book that I've been thinking about for over 20 years. And it started because back in the day when you used to channel surf, the oldies will remember this, you know, that you were flip through. Anyway, my husband and I were doing this. My husband was also a historian of early modern Britain. And so we were channel surfing and we found this program from the BBC on the alternate authors of Shakespeare. And we started doing what you do in those situations, which we started yelling at the television. And every time somebody would say, well, it couldn't have been Shakespeare because X, we would say, yes, it could, yes, it could. And that was the moment when I decided that if there was something that historians could say that was useful about authorship, and that it wasn't that there were things we knew, there were ways we thought that would be a useful contribution to a debate, which actually shouldn't be a debate. So I'm gonna say, you know, why did I have to write this book? It's because there are lots of different people who, for various reasons, think Shakespeare was not Shakespeare. That Shakespeare was written by Ian Bassano. This came out, I think, yesterday or today. And you know, I just love this. You know, and one of my friends put this on Blue Sky and said, "You might be interested in this, Susan." And then the major candidates are the Earl of Oxford, and then Francis Bacon, but Christopher Marlowe, I can't remember all. I mean, you know, so there are all these theories, and they come out of a set of assumptions about why authorship is important, who is an author, because Shakespeare is the greatest writer in the English language. How can we say this? But anyway, but that's not to say he's not a good writer, right? It's not like those hierarchies are so weird. But because of that, people have assumed that he had to be from an upper class family. He had to have the right education. He had to have traveled. Um, and so it couldn't have been a man whose father was a glover in a provincial town who went to a grammar school. And was not a fortune. Well, actually he was, but that's another story. So is there a question for a historian? No. So the thing about this discussion is that among historians who work on this period, there is no discussion. In fact, you know, if somebody brings up the authorship controversy, we all sort of roll our eyes and, you know, bang our heads against, you know, we just like, because it's so obvious to us. So in writing this book, which I was going to write in the spring of 2020, and I was going to be traveling to all these libraries, and I was going to be all sorts of things I was going to be doing in the spring of 2020, which I didn't end up doing. So, and I want to say thanks to the library. I hate Hathi Trust, but thank God for Hathi Trust. Well, I mean, especially on the modern stuff, you have to read it page by page, and you can never download a chapter. And it was like it was a pain. But I could keep slowly writing, but I wasn't doom scrolling. So, but the thing is, there's lots of evidence, and so what kinds of evidence are there? There's the types of historical sources we have for the period. I'm not going to talk about them today but I talk about them in the book. So it's actually, for the historians here, it's a stealth introduction to historical method. So what are the surviving sources that we can use to understand Shakespeare and Shakespeare's life? And I come at this as a social historian who has worked on ordinary people in Shakespeare's England for over 40 years now, almost 50. And so there are types of historical evidence. There's Shakespeare's education, because people who don't think Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare make a lot of his education. And Shakespeare's company and the evidence of printed works, and contemporary evidence. So there's a lot of evidence that we can use, and I try to show how that works in the book. So, for example, I'm going to start with education, just because we're at a university and we might as well. And so the knot on Shakespeare's education is based on what Ben Jonson wrote in an epitaph or epigraph to the first folio. So the first folio is the complete works of Shakespeare published by the company he was a part of 7 years after he died. And the introductory poem is written by Ben Jonson. And in it, he said, he compares Shakespeare to all the great writers. And then he said, though thou hadst small Latin and less Greek, you know, then he compares him to the great Greek tragedians. You know, so the thing about Shakespeare is like, well, small Latin and less Greek, so he really wasn't educated. So one of the really fun things I really got into as I was working on this was what you learned in grammar school. So grammar schools existed for boys, only boys, and there are a lot of them. This period around the time that Shakespeare was born is there's a huge expansion of educational access. But there had actually been a grammar school in Stratford-upon-Avon, where Shakespeare was born, since the 15th century. And the school was endowed to pay a master from later in the 15th century. So a century before Shakespeare was born, there was an endowment of the school and for a master who was paid £20 a year, which is not a bad salary, not great, but not terrible. Um, and so what did you learn in grammar school? First of all, there's one textbook that was licensed for use in schools, Livy's Latin Grammar, and every school in England had to use it. And there are lots of copies surviving because every school in England, and they're all, they're not in great shape, but in their gazillion editions, because this is like everybody has to. And in the first year in grammar school, there's a little bit of translation, English to Latin. But from second year on, your education is in Latin. And you're reading texts in Latin, and then you're translating them into English, and then you're translating them back into Latin. By the third year, you're maybe starting to do imitations. So they say, write a speech in the manner of Cicero, or or follow Caesar. What are all these different models? And you write it in Latin, you translate to English, then you write it back in Latin. So it's a very literary education. It is, in fact, the only literary education in 16th and early 17th century England. Because when you went to university, you were being trained to be a clergyman. You weren't being trained to be a writer or a literary critic. You wouldn't have studied, So this is all, it's a literary education. And they're still teaching some English and some math. But this is an education, it's a humanist education for life in public. And part of the education is to put on plays. So every week, the boys would put on a scene from, and they start with comedies, and then as they get older, they do more serious Roman plays and then English plays. But just to give you a sense of some of the things they read, these are some of the writers that the Norwich Grammar School had students meet. And in Norwich, the local assembly, Norwich is the second largest city in England, and the civic assembly passes a set of ordinances that list the things that should be read by students. And so I just picked the ones, because I don't know all the authors that they were reading, but Virgil, Horace, Juvenal, Horace, Cicero, Caesar, Erasmus, many others. But this is not a little light reading, this is pretty serious. And then in your fifth year, you started studying Greek. And in Greek, you would read the New Testament, you would read Hesiod, Homer, Aesop, Euripides, Lucian, and various other Greek authors. So when Johnson snidely says small Latin and less Greek, this is comparative. And Johnson really loved learning. I don't think Shakespeare necessarily loved scholarship, and he didn't love the Latin. Johnson really loved the classical stuff. But the other thing at the Norwich Grammar School, and this is pretty common when we have lines for the school, the High Master shall yearly appoint betwixt Hallowmas, that's Halloween, and Christmas, some learned dialogue and comedy, or two comedies at the least, to be learned without book. So any of you who are theater people, without book, so you're learning by heart. By the said scholars, so as they may play the same at Christmas, at the appointment of the Mr. Mayor, and for the better accomplishment thereof, the city shall bear the charges of apparel in that behalf. So the city is paying for the costumes. And this is a performance for the people, for the elite of Norwich, but also undoubtedly not just the city council, but all the great, the good, in addition to the parents. And the other thing is to say, grammar school was free. You did not pay. I mean, you had to buy any book and a notebook and things like that. But so there's this is a pretty rigorous literary and theatrical education. And because it's designed to make you perform in public, no matter what you were doing, so you could go from grammar school to the university to become a clergyman. You could go from grammar school to the Inns of Court to become a lawyer. And obviously, lawyers and clergy preach need to be able to speak in public as part of their deal, right? But you could also be apprenticed and just become a successful local merchant or artisan. You didn't have to be highly educated. I mean, in post-secondary education, but if you're a very successful merchant in a town like Stratford, you become part of the town council, and then you have to argue for the town. The people of Stratford, of which Shakespeare's father was one of the leading members of the council, they're having arguments with the Earl of Warwick, who is the lord of the manor that includes Stratford, about revenues from various things. And the Earl of Warwick's brother is Queen Elizabeth's favorite, the Earl of Leicester. So these provincial nobodies are going toe to toe with the brother of the Queen's favorite. So these are men who are confident and able to understand the law, understand rhetoric, are able to make these arguments and feel comfortable making these arguments. So this is an education that prepares you for being in public. And one scholar I read said, essentially, if you had wanted to design education to produce actors and playwrights, this is the education. And there are a lot of people writing plays. We think there are about 3,000 plays published, written and performed between 1560 and 1640. We have about 500 of them. So, and not all of them were performed, certainly not all of them were published, but even of those who were published, we don't know who wrote a whole lot of them. Most of those which are published without an author. So this is a very vibrant theatrical world, and theater is a main part of it. So I'm going to skip a whole lot of stuff I talk about in the book about London. But the quick thing to say about London is an international city. It is now, it was then. Shakespeare lodged with French Huguenots. So, when he scatters some French words in a text, it's easier. He didn't have to go to France to learn it. People come from all over the world to London. And I would also argue that if you have read the plays, it's not as if Romeo and Juliet really gives you a good sense of Verona. And I wouldn't do a tour of Denmark based on Hamlet, just suggesting, off the top of my head, these are not, you do not have to go to any of these places to write these plays. So I want to talk about the other piece of evidence that I think is really important. So education is one, but why a grammar school would prepare somebody to be a writer like Shakespeare. But then there's also publication, and we have, so one of the things that's unusual is that there are actually plays published in his lifetime with Shakespeare's name on them. So we have Love's Labour's Lost. This is newly corrected and augmented by W. Shakespeare. So he was revising his own plays. These are some more. Richard II by William Shakespeare, Much Ado About Nothing. I say have sundry times publicly acted by the Right Honorable Lord Chamberlain's his servants. Shakespeare's a member of a company that is called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which in 1603 becomes the King's Men. Most plays are published with the name of the company that performed them, because the company owned the play. So copyright doesn't exist as we know it. So the author doesn't own the play. Their work is owned by the company that commissioned it. So here's Hamlet, William Shakespeare, and then King Lear. Again, and by this time, King James has become the king, and they are the King's Men by His Majesty's servants, because in theory, the group of actors are servants of a particular nobleman, or after 1603, a member of the royal family. And then there are also Shakespeare plays that are published without his name on it. This is Romeo and Juliet, and the Titus Andronicus. And these are late in Shakespeare's career. This is 1609 and 1611, when Shakespeare is clearly well known. After his death, the members of the King's Men, put together what's called the first folio of Mr. William Shakespeare's comedies, histories, and tragedies, published according to the true original comedies. And it's edited by other members of the King's Men who had acted with him for many years. And so, but there are also, and I didn't show these, there are also plays that are published with his name on them that are not his. So it was worth pretending it was by Shakespeare. So he was well enough known as a writer that it was in somebody's interest to claim to be written by Shakespeare, even if it wasn't. So those are kind of the kinds of evidence that we have. Historians, we prefer evidence from the time. And there is a lot of evidence at the time about Shakespeare's life. And Shakespeare being a writer as well as an actor. He's also co-owner. He's called a sharer in the company. So he shares in the profits of the King's Men or the Lord Chamberlain's Men. He also becomes a co-owner of 10% of the Globe Theater and later the Blackfriars Theater, the indoor theater that the King's Men start playing in 1609. One of the things that I actually wonder, this is a little bit heretical, but if he got bored with writing, one of the things that's really strange to think about somebody like Shakespeare is we know what he wrote. We don't know much about the rest of his life. We know some of the places he lived in London. We now know that his wife spent time in London with him, which was not surprising, but we actually have evidence of it. There was a long time when people were, I think, have an investment in saying she was terrible and blah, 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 but don't think so. Um, um, we know a lot about that, but a big part of his life was acting. He was an actor as well as a writer. Um, um, I, I think the assumption is he was a character. Was the character actor. He was never the hero. He was not the romantic hero. He was not the king, but he was an actor. We don't know why he went to London. There's a lot we don't know. But of course, we don't know a lot about lots of people, right? And in fact, we don't know a lot about lots of writers. There are big gaps in the life of Christopher Marlowe or Ben Jonson, Thomas Middleton, all sorts of gaps in people's lives. That's just normal for 17th century England. So we have lots of evidence about him. And what the book tries to do is tell a story. It's not really a biography of Shakespeare as much as it's placing his biography in the course in the world he lived in, to try to show why, for historians, this is not a question. There's no reason to even ask the question. So I actually have no opinions about any of the candidates except no. So I'm going to stop there and take questions. I'm happy to say more about the book, talk about things you wonder about. I may or may not be able to answer them. One of the things the book does is also talk a lot about the history of theater in the period, history of London, so that the worlds that he inhabits become alive, and we can understand him not as the great writer, but as a human being, who was a great writer, but it was in his life, it was just a person. So anyway, I'm going to take questions, answer any questions. There's lots in the book that I haven't talked about, and I'm happy to sort of pick up on anything.
Sorry, Susan, I know you talked about this. And again, this is like stuff I learned as graduate student in literature a long time ago.
Yeah.
And you probably, what literature professors say and you say are probably not the same thing, but there's sort of a general handwriting thing is that his poetry was considered high literature and really important, and his playwriting was more a way of living. Do you think that's true?
So I'm going to say I'm speaking from great ignorance here, but the consensus is actually, other than the sonnets, that he only published poetry in the early 1590s when the theaters were closed, and his options for making money. And actually, those first publications were published by a man named Richard Field, who grew up in Stratford. He was about 3 years older than Shakespeare, is apprenticed at the age of 18 to one of the leading printers in London, a man named Vautelier. Serves his apprenticeship, and after he's completed his apprenticeship, Vautelier died, and Field goes into a partnership with Vautelier's widow and then marries her, and is one of the leading printers in England, in London, which is where all the printers are really, of French and Italian works, but also publishes the translation of Plutarch's Lives, Holinshed's Chronicles, some of the texts that Shakespeare uses in his writing are published by this guy who's 3 years older than him, who grew up in Stratford and presumably went to the same grammar school. So so I think, I think in his poetry, if you think about the education he had, there was a whole lot of imitating, so he knew how to write a Petrarchan sonnet because you were taught to do that in school. In fact, there's one school which gives students a theme every week, actually 2 themes a week. And on one day they write poetry from that theme, and on the next day they write prose from that theme, or vice versa. And so they're busy writing in these different styles. So he's learned to write poetry, and he's a gifted writer. That's but it's not clear to me that writing poetry was what he loved. But it's not even clear to me that he loved writing. I mean, right? I mean, he liked writing, but yeah.
Recognizing that the past is a foreign country.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, I was thinking about him as kind of this triple threat, writer, actor, and what's called a producer. And I'm wondering if it's useful to think of modern analogies of people who, somebody like Ben Affleck or, Matt Damon, who start writing a screenplay, then they become actors, and then they, become the money behind production. Is that kind of his trajectory, that he goes from being the screenwriter to the executive producer over the course of his career?
So the short answer is we don't know. So we don't even know. He goes to London. So here's what we know. He gets married in 1582 when he's 18. And Shakespeare's first child, Susanna, is born 6 months later, which is not unusual. Probably 20 to 30% of all brides in England at this time are pregnant when they marry. And so this is, it's not scandalous. It's not a big deal. And then they have twins in 1585, Hamlet and Judith. And sometime after that, he's in London, and probably, this is like, if you extrapolate backwards, probably acting occasionally as a kind of freelance actor in companies, probably writing. Well, we know he starts writing with other people because a lot of writing at this time is collaborative. So one of the other things that you have to let go of as a modern person is the notion that that the single author is the ideal. So especially at the beginning and at the end of his career, Shakespeare is collaboratively writing, but lots of people are collaboratively writing. Almost everybody is collaboratively writing because the repertory companies need new plays on a pretty regular basis. So there are writers who one writer contributes to 17 plays in a year.
It sounds almost like a showrunner for a TV series.
Yeah, and so a lot of the writing is, my editor said, it's TV writers' room, and it's the TV writers' room, right? Okay, Laura, you write this plot, Savion, you do that one, and then maybe I'll be the one who sort of makes it into a whole, right? Some plays have 3 writers as listed on the title page. That's I think Eastward Ho is the one that I have in the book, where the multiple authors are shown on the title page. So writing is collaborative, and if any of you were theater nerds in high school, theater is collaborative. You can't put on a play without working with other people. And it gets changed by other people, right? That's the other piece of that, right? You don't, oh, that's not working, let's fix this. So Shakespeare, we think, is working as an actor for hire. because there are the companies, but they always need other people, and so they hire people maybe for a season, maybe for something else. And so they, that only works. So we think he's doing that. We know he's doing some writing. The first play that at least some people think he contributed to that we have is Art de Faversham from 1590. There are questions about other plays that may be earlier. But the chronology, I will just say, I read it all. And it is above my pay grade. The arguments about chronology and authorship are based, a lot of them are being based now on different statistical models for how you assess who is the author. What you think of as the issues that you look for. And those things, I've read them. I can kind of understand them. And then I'm like, okay, what I need to know and what a historian wants to know is, when does this happen? How does this happen? And, it doesn't change my argument whether Two Gentlemen of Verona was, which is, I think, the one that some people think was written before. Whether that was written when he was in Stratford and performed in Stratford, that was one theory I read. That doesn't affect what I have to say. And so I feel that I learned a lot. The book history work is just fascinating. The work on the printing. And I learned a lot from the people who did that. And I'm very grateful to the people who shared. There was this moment where I was trying to download a database. There's a database of early English playbooks, deep. And I was trying to download the database because I was having trouble searching it. And I thought I can do it as an Excel. And they said, oh, to download to this. And so I'm trying to download it all. I finally wrote to people who did. I got an email back from one of the editors of this, one of the scholars who did this, and he said, "Why are you interested in this?" Which wasn't so much, which was like, I know who you are, but why are you doing this? And why are you looking at playbooks? But so I looked at like all the playbooks. I know how many books were published, playbooks were published during the period of Shakespeare's working, and how many of them are anonymous, how many authors we know. So I did a lot of that work, but some of the authorship stuff is really, it's not for the faint of heart. So yeah. And one of the questions is, so when you become a sharer in a company, and he becomes a sharer in Lord Chamberlain's Men, apparently when it's formed in 1594. By 1594, when it's formed and he's a sharer, because he gets paid by the records of his payment from the court. And so the question is, how did he have the money to do it? And so the answer is, we do not know. One person suggested that he put up his scripts as kind of collateral. But in general, you paid about £50, which was a lot of money. So maybe he'd earned that money working in London. Maybe he'd earned that, And we just don't know. And what happened to his family? Were they always in Stratford? Did they come back and forth? Again, we don't know. But once he's a sharer in the company, he becomes a wealthy man because he shares in the profits of one of the leading companies in London. In 1597, he buys the largest house in Stratford. It's not the nicest house in Stratford at the time because it the previous owner had kind of not maintained it well. So as you know, as they say in current real estate, it needed some love. So, but he bought the largest house in Stratford. And this is just a fun side geeky historian thing. When you bought property, property records are really good. And that's always true. If you do family history, you may have trouble finding birth records if there's not, if there's not civil registration. But property records are really common because everybody wants everybody to know that they own the land they own. And so there's no county recorder of deeds as there is now, but what you did was you entered into a collusive lawsuit. So when Savion buys my house, right? She then sues me for trespassing. I don't contest it. So there's a settlement that says Savion that they own the property. That's how it works. And that's cool, right? And this document is recorded in parchment, and it's put on one piece of parchment, so like this. And there are 3 copies on that piece of parchment. One of them goes down this way, and the other 2 go this way. And then somebody cuts between them a kind of wavy line. And you can prove the authenticity of the record by putting them together. And very unusually, we have all 3 copies. Not for the original purchase of Shakespeare's House, New Place. It's a great story. Right after Shakespeare buys the house, the previous owner is murdered by his son, poisoned by his son, and eventually tried for parricide. I love it, right? And so Shakespeare, like a couple of years later, he gets an exemplification, and then he does another one of these collusive lawsuits with the second son who did not murder his father. So, and all 3 copies of that second thing exist. One because it's kept in the public record office, but the 2 copies, the buyers and the sellers copies have both survived and are at the Folger. So you can actually see how the 3 pieces fit together. And I should actually say, one of the best things in the world is that the Folger Shakespeare Library has a website called Shakespeare Documented, which has every document we know of about Shakespeare. And they keep, every now and then there's new stuff added, and they say it's still growing. And most people can't read 17th century handwriting, but they have transcriptions of almost everything. And they also have these nice little essays that say, here's how this lawsuit works. And here's how these pieces of parchment fit together. But so this is all up on the web. And one of the decisions I made a couple of decisions very early in the process. One was that I was going to use publicly available information. I wanted, there's so much of the authorship controversy is like, there's some secret thing that somebody knows. There's no secret thing. And there are no secrets. And so I've worked almost entirely from printed sources and the records online in Shakespeare Documented. And I also never used a play as a source for Shakespeare's life. The plays, I don't assume that the plays are autobiographical. So the one exception I made was that to explain type of performance in England, which was the interlude. I did say the tragedy of Perilous and Thisbe is an interlude in the wedding, and that's how those things work. It's a short thing that entertains people between courses, but then it's not a full play. So that's I'm going with yeah. So,
Susan, was it challenging to get someone to publish your book, or is it because you're coming from the history discipline, the fact of your legacy of scholarship? Just because, as you mentioned, like Shakespeare, there's a lot,
there's a lot.
but you're taking a different name.
Yeah, I mean, it actually took longer than I expected, and I think because it's not a traditional book. So it took an editor who could see what this book could be to take it on. It is published as a trade book, which is why it's less expensive. And my editor worked with me a lot to make the text accessible. So I was doing a podcast recording today, and the person who was interviewing me said, you know, I'm a theater person, but this was not intimidating to read. That's the goal. This is really written so that you could read it, or you could give it to your Uncle Harry who loves theater, or your mother who goes to any Shakespeare play that they can't, you know, I mean, that's how I wrote it. I really wrote it for everyone. I'm not, so it's not a monograph. It's not, there's no startling new discovery. I can't tell you that Shakespeare was a Black Jewish woman. Which, by the way, Amelia Basano was not a Black Jewish woman. We will just go leave that aside. But you know, I don't have great new discoveries. I basically am saying, if you're a historian, this is not a question. So I talked to a bunch of places, literature editors. A lot of them didn't know what to do with it because it didn't fit their categories, right? You know, so when you're doing something that's different, like, you know, but I published with Manchester University Press, which is a major university press. It has a really good Shakespeare list. So it was, you know, so yes, I talked to lots of publishers, but so it was a little hard, but not terrible. So other questions?
Was the paper site at Stanford before or after Gilman?
No, yeah,
I'm just curious, you know.
no, I mean, that's, you know, actually, I think it's going more. I mean, because Hamlet is 1599.
Sure,
It's about more or less at the same time. But yeah,
I recently watched Hamlet.
Yeah.
The film, and I was curious if you came across different spellings of Shakespeare's wife's name in your research.
Yeah.
Any
Yeah.
explanation on why she was called Amussen maybe?
I could say that that's an affectation, but so here's the thing with names. They get written in lots of different ways in the 16th and 17th century. And lots of names, sort of Edmund and Edward. And it's
Hamlet.
yeah, well, Hamlet is actually his son's name. So yeah, I mean, you know, Joanna, Johanna, you know, you have all these different spellings of names regularly, partly because they're different scribes. And, you know, they listen by ear. It's not like, I mean, I meet people and I think, you know, if I'm introducing myself, depending on the context, I might spell out my last name because Amussen is not actually a name that people know how to spell. It's not like Smith. And, you know, and I discovered since I've been in Merced that sometimes my Starbucks name is Susan with a Z. You know, I mean, right? Different people, when you, you know, people spell differently. So yeah, but Agnes and Anne are not actually different names. So, for people in the 17th century. So yeah, and I haven't seen Hamlet yet. I haven't read it yet. I really want to read it first. But it's really what, yeah, no. So other questions?
I do also want to maybe do the raffle and
Okay.
then,
Okay, and then I will say, if anybody buys the book and wants me to sign it, I'm happy to sign it. And
so let's, first of all, let's see Dr. Amussen. Gonna bring it up here and then ask you if you want to hold the winner.
oh my gosh, okay. Nobody has their name on it, so I don't know anything.
Yes, just numbers.
2, 3, 4.
I'm going to decline because I'm going to buy a copy. Let someone, if I can afford to buy a copy, let someone else.
All right.
Okay, 230. Okay. 223.
Thank you so much. And this is actually the book we're raffling off.
What a privilege to have this from my department here. Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you. Let's give you a round of applause.